Have you ever wondered what kind of truths lie buried under centuries of silence? Truths so disturbing that even time itself seems reluctant to remember them. Some stories are not confined to dusty books or faded manuscripts. They live like shadows, clinging to the walls of old castles, whispering through abandoned streets, and echoing in the minds of those who dare to look back. Tonight, I will guide you into that darkness. But before we begin, take a moment, if you truly feel ready, to like this video. Tell me in the comments where in the world you are listening from, and subscribe to the channel. It will let me know that you are brave enough to continue this journey, because what you are about to hear may not let you sleep easily. Picture this, a flickering candle in a cold chamber. The flame dances nervously, as though even fire itself trembles at the secrets waiting to be told. Every chapter we uncover will not simply be a tale, it will be a door. Behind each door lies a moment in history where horror was not invented by imagination, but was lived, endured, and often never spoken of again. The very earth we walk on is soaked with these stories, and tonight you will walk across that haunted ground. There are plagues that drove people into frenzies of madness until their bodies collapsed. There are rulers who feasted on cruelty, turning torture into an art form. There are ships that vanished without a trace, leaving behind only a few broken clues that tease us with unanswered questions. You will hear of children lost in crusades, of skeletons sleeping under cities where millions now stroll unsuspectingly, and of explorers who faced icy deaths in lands no human was meant to conquer. But history, even at its darkest, has a peculiar sense of irony. Sometimes its cruelties are wrapped in absurdity, and you may find yourself laughing, an uneasy laugh, the kind you let slip when you know you should not, when the horror is too overwhelming to do anything but grin. That nervous laughter is not betrayal. It is survival. Humans have always coped with darkness by turning it into a story, a joke, a memory that could be passed down without shattering the listener. Tonight you will feel that same strange balance, fear pressing in on you, and a smile tugging at your lips when you least expect it. And here's the question you must keep asking yourself. If you had lived through these moments, would you have endured? If you were one of the children sent off to fight for faith, would your tiny feet have carried you back home? If you had been trapped in the frozen wastelands of the Arctic with nothing left to eat, would you have chosen to survive by any means necessary? Or would history have swallowed you whole, burying your name alongside countless others whose lives ended in silence? This journey we are beginning is not about ghosts in the Hollywood sense, though there will be spirits here, and you may feel them brush against your imagination. It is about the ghosts of truth, the specters of events that really happened, carried across centuries like wounds that never heal. When you listen closely, you will notice that these are not distant stories. They are mirrors. They remind us of what humans are capable of: cruelty, resilience, madness, brilliance, and sometimes unspeakable horror. So, let us take a step together. The night is quiet. The world outside your window might be safe, wrapped in the calm routine of modern life. But here, in this space, we are traveling backwards, into bloodied fields, into candlelit chambers of kings and killers, into graveyards where bones are stacked higher than the living could ever climb. This is not fiction, my friend. These are whispers in the dark, and they are waiting for you. Close your eyes for a moment, and imagine waking up one summer morning in the bustling city of Strasbourg in the year 1518. The streets are narrow, the air is heavy with the smell of bread fresh from stone ovens, and the chatter of merchants fills the square. But on this particular morning, something feels different. You hear music, but not the joyful kind. Instead, it is the sound of shoes scraping against cobblestones, a relentless pounding of feet. At first, you might assume there is a festival or a wedding parade. But when you turn the corner, your heart freezes. Dozens of people are dancing, not gracefully, not with smiles, but with wild, frantic movements. Their faces are pale, their eyes glazed, and sweat pours down their skin. They do not stop when the sun rises higher. They do not stop when their knees buckle or when their feet bleed. They dance until they collapse, some never to rise again. This is no celebration. This is a plague. The dancing plague of 1518 began with one woman, Frau Trophia. She stepped into the street and started to dance. No music, no partner, just her body jerking and twirling uncontrollably. At first, her neighbors laughed. They clapped along, thinking it was some strange display. But then she did not stop. For hours, then days, she kept moving, unable to rest. Soon others joined her, as if the madness were contagious. Within weeks, over 400 people were caught in the same terrifying rhythm. Now ask yourself, what could cause an entire city to dance itself into exhaustion and death? Some believed it was divine punishment, God striking sinners with uncontrollable motion. Others whispered of curses from saints angered by disobedience. Still others thought it was demonic possession. Imagine living in that time when science was fragile and the unknown explained itself through fear. If you saw your neighbor collapse after 3 straight days of dancing, what would you believe? Modern historians and scientists have tried to explain it. One theory suggests ergot poisoning, bread contaminated with a fungus that produces hallucinogens similar to LSD. If you have ever wondered what mass hysteria looks like, picture hundreds of starving, feverish people, their minds warped by toxins, their bodies flailing in a frenzy they could not control. Another theory suggests it was a psychological outbreak, stress, famine and disease crushing people's minds until their bodies revolted through motion. Stress dancing, taken to the most horrific extreme. But here's the part that makes the story truly chilling. The authorities at the time did not know what to do. Instead of stopping the dancing, they encouraged it. They believed the cure for compulsive movement was more movement. They even hired musicians to play, hoping that the dancers would dance themselves free of the plague. Imagine the absurdity. A city square turned into a deadly festival, with fiddles and drums urging exhausted people toward their graves. And yes, people died. Heart attacks, strokes, sheer exhaustion. They danced until their lungs could no longer draw breath. They danced until their hearts gave out. The chronicles describe men and women dropping dead in the middle of the frenzy. No escape, no cure, just endless movement. If you close your eyes and place yourself there, what would you have done? Would you have been swept up by the hysteria, your legs carrying you against your will? Would you have tried to run, only to realize that running and dancing looked the same when madness took over the crowd? Or would you have stood in the corner, laughing nervously, until your own body betrayed you and joined the rhythm? There is a bitter humor in it, is not there? Imagine being forced to dance until you die. In another world, it sounds like the setup to a bizarre reality show. But in Strasbourg, it was a nightmare. The city became a stage, and its citizens the unwilling performers of a play that ended only with death. And even now, centuries later, no one can fully explain it. Science offers theories, but the mystery lingers. Was it poison? Was it mass psychosis? Or was it something darker, a curse, a punishment? A reminder that human beings are never truly safe from the unknown. Perhaps the scariest part is this: mass hysteria still exists today. If it happened once, could it happen again? And if it did, would you be able to resist the pull of the crowd? The dancing plague of 1518 reminds us that sometimes the strangest horrors are not monsters or ghosts, but ourselves, our bodies, our minds, and the way fear spreads faster than fire. So next time your feet start tapping to a rhythm you can't control, maybe you will remember the people of Strasbourg, who danced into the arms of death. Imagine the endless Arctic, a horizon of white stretching in every direction, the air so cold it stings your lungs, and silence so heavy it feels like the earth itself has stopped breathing. In 1845, 2 ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, set out from England under the command of Sir John Franklin. Their mission was ambitious, almost heroic, to chart the last unnavigated sections of the Northwest Passage, the icy sea route that would connect Europe to Asia. But instead of glory, they found only desolation. Picture over 120 men, proud sailors, disciplined officers, all believing they were equipped with the best technology of their time. The ships were fitted with reinforced iron hulls, steam engines, and provisions for 3 years. To their families, to their country, they seemed unstoppable, men conquering nature's fiercest frontier. But within a few years, every single one of them would vanish, leaving behind only fragments of horror scattered across the ice. What happened? The story unfolds in whispers across the frozen tundra. Inuit oral histories tell of starving men, their eyes hollow, staggering through snowstorms in desperate search of food. Archaeologists later discovered abandoned camps, cooking pots still black with soot, and human bones marked with the unmistakable signs of cannibalism. Imagine that moment, when hunger claws so deep into your stomach that you look at your friend not as a companion, but as the only way to survive another day. There is a haunting irony in this tragedy. The ships carried ample food, neatly stored in tins. But later investigations revealed that many of those tins were sealed with lead, contaminating the supplies. The very food that was supposed to preserve life instead poisoned the men slowly, clouding their minds, weakening their bodies. Combine that with the brutal cold, scurvy, and the crushing isolation, and you have the perfect recipe for despair. One journal entry recovered from the expedition notes that Franklin himself died early, leaving his officers and crew to make desperate choices. Some attempted to march south across hundreds of miles of ice, dragging boats and supplies on makeshift sledges. Few made it far. Their frozen remains, discovered decades later, still wore tattered uniforms, medals pinned proudly to lifeless chests. Skeletons lay sprawled across the snow, some mutilated in ways that hinted at acts no one dared speak of. And yet, despite all this evidence, mystery still shrouds the Franklin expedition. For over 150 years, no one could find the ships themselves. It was not until 2014 that the wreck of HMS Erebus was located, lying eerily preserved beneath Arctic waters. 2 years later, HMS Terror was discovered as well, its decks hauntingly intact, as if the crew had only just stepped away. Walking through the ship today is like entering a tomb where time itself froze, every cabin a silent witness to suffering. Now let us pause for a moment and place yourself in that icy wilderness. The wind bites your face, snow blinds your eyes, and your comrades fall one by one. Would you keep moving south, clinging to hope of rescue, or would you stay aboard the ship, waiting for salvation that never comes? Which choice would you make, knowing that both roads end in death? There is a strange fascination Americans have with stories like this, perhaps because they reveal the limits of human courage. We admire the boldness of exploration, but we shiver when we see its price. And deep down, we laugh nervously at the absurdity. Men surrounded by food, killed by the very tins meant to save them. Men surrounded by ice, dying of thirst because all that ice was locked beyond their reach. The Franklin expedition is both comedy and tragedy, if comedy can exist in the darkest sense of the word. And maybe the scariest thought of all is that the Arctic still hides secrets. Even with modern technology, even with satellites and submarines, vast stretches of that frozen world remain untouched. What if more ships are buried there, their crews waiting in silence? What if Franklin's men were not entirely victims of nature, but of something else, something that does not want to be found? The Franklin expedition is more than history. It is a reminder. It tells us that ambition has teeth, that nature does not forgive, and that sometimes the bravest journeys end not in discovery, but in disappearance. Picture Europe in the early 13th century. The air smells of wood smoke, church bells echo across valleys, and whispers of holy war stir restless hearts. The Crusades had already dragged thousands of knights and soldiers into the Middle East, their banners drenched in both blood and faith. But in the year 1212, something far stranger happened, something so haunting that it continues to puzzle historians to this day. It was not an army of warriors that rose. It was an army of children. Imagine the sight. Thousands of boys and girls, some barely old enough to carry a loaf of bread, marching barefoot along dusty roads. They carried wooden crosses, sang hymns, and proclaimed that God Himself had chosen them to reclaim the Holy Land. To the people who saw them pass through villages, it was both inspiring and terrifying. Mothers wept, fathers crossed themselves, and priests debated whether this was a miracle or madness. The movement began in two places, almost simultaneously. In France, a boy named Stephen of Cloyes claimed to have visions from Christ, commanding him to lead a crusade. In Germany, another boy, Nicholas, gathered followers with the same burning conviction. Word spread quickly, as it always does when desperation and faith collide. Within weeks, thousands of children abandoned their homes, believing their innocence alone would succeed where hardened soldiers had failed. But reality is cruel, and innocence is no shield against hunger, exhaustion, or betrayal. The children marched for hundreds of miles under scorching sun and pouring rain. Many starved, their small bodies unable to endure the endless journey. Some froze while crossing the Alps, collapsing in snow that swallowed their cries. And yet they pressed on, convinced that miracles awaited them at the sea. And what awaited them? Not miracles. In Marseille, legend says that unscrupulous merchants promised ships to carry the children to the Holy Land. But instead of reaching Jerusalem, many were sold into slavery in North Africa. Picture that betrayal. Children who had left home believing they were chosen by God, now shackled and dragged across foreign markets like cattle. Others simply vanished, swallowed by the chaos of medieval life, their names lost to history. Historians still debate the details. Was it truly thousands, or have later storytellers exaggerated the numbers? Were they all children, or were some poor peasants swept up in the movement? Was it a unified crusade or separate events later combined into one legend? The uncertainty only deepens the unease, for sometimes the blur between myth and truth feels more frightening than either alone. And here's where you must place yourself. If you were a parent in that era and your child insisted on marching away with the holy army of children, what would you do? Would you cling to them, begging them to stay, or would you step aside, believing, terrified, that perhaps God had indeed chosen them? There is no comfortable answer, is there? There is also a dark humor in the way medieval chroniclers described it. Some mocked the children as naive fools, little lambs walking to slaughter. Others claimed it was proof of divine punishment, that society had become so corrupt, even its children had to die to remind adults of their sins. And so, tragedy became sermon, loss became lesson. The voices of the children themselves were never recorded. The Children's Crusade is disturbing not just for its suffering, but because it reminds us of how dangerous pure belief can be when it is untempered by reason. Innocence, often romanticized, did not protect them. Faith, celebrated as strength, became a weapon turned inward. And in the end, the children paid the price. When you think of history's horrors, wars and massacres may come to mind. But sometimes the deepest chill comes from imagining a child, barefoot, hungry, singing hymns under the hot sun, believing they are marching toward salvation, only to disappear into silence. That is the true haunting of the Children's Crusade, not just that so many were lost, but that they were lost believing they were chosen. Beneath the bustling streets of Palermo, Sicily, lies a world where the dead still seem to move among the living. Imagine descending into a dim passageway, the air heavy with dust and centuries-old silence. The walls are lined not with stone or plaster but with bodies, thousands of them. Some hang upright in niches, clothed in decaying robes. Others rest on shelves, their skulls grinning through leathery skin. This is not a horror movie set. This is the Capuchin Catacombs, one of history's most disturbing resting places. Among these preserved remains, there are some so lifelike, so strangely intact, that visitors often feel the dead are watching them. And some skeletons appear to dance, their limbs twisted or raised in postures eerily animated. Imagine standing there with only the dim glow of a lantern, your shadow flickering across rows of corpses, when suddenly you realize one of the skeletons looks as if it is waving, or worse, inviting you closer. The catacombs date back to the late 16th century, when Capuchin monks began preserving their dead brothers. At first, it was a matter of practicality. The monks discovered that the cool, dry air beneath their monastery preserved bodies naturally. But soon, preservation turned into ritual. Wealthy citizens of Palermo requested to be buried there, displayed in their finest clothes, as if death itself could not strip them of their status. Over time, more than 8,000 bodies filled the catacombs. Men, women, children, priests, all arranged in haunting rows that resemble an audience frozen mid-motion. One of the most famous of these preserved bodies is little Rosalia Lombardo, a 2-year-old girl who died in 1920. Nicknamed Sleeping Beauty, her tiny body is so perfectly preserved that she still looks as though she might wake at any moment, her delicate eyelashes resting gently on her cheeks. Tourists report that under certain lighting, her eyes appear to open slightly, a trick of shadows, or something more unsettling. Imagine leaning in to look, only to feel those glassy eyes flicker toward you. But it is the so-called dancing skeletons that stir the deepest unease. Some appear twisted into poses of motion, arms raised, spines curved, legs bent as though caught mid-step. Scholars argue that these postures are the natural result of time and gravity. But visitors whisper other possibilities, that the dead are not entirely at rest, that the catacombs themselves pulse with some strange energy, keeping the line between life and death uncomfortably thin. Now pause for a moment. What would you do if you were left alone in those tunnels, lantern fading, surrounded by silent crowds of corpses? Would you dare walk past the figure that looks like it might leap from its niche at any second? Or would you run, knowing that running in the dark might mean tripping over bones scattered across the floor? There is a grim humor here too, if you can stomach it. The monks believed that displaying the dead was a way to remind the living of their own mortality. Memento mori, they would say. Remember that you must die. And in a way, it is almost theatrical. Whole families preserved together, still dressed as if heading to Sunday Mass, waiting eternally for visitors who will never arrive. It is macabre, yes, but also absurd, like a play where the actors never leave the stage. Science tries to demystify it. Studies reveal that the preservation was achieved through natural mummification, removing organs, drying bodies in special chambers, and later treating them with vinegar or lime. The dancing poses, likely the result of how corpses were hung on hooks or arranged in niches, shifting slightly over centuries. Rational explanations, yes, but none of that stops your imagination when you are standing face to face with a corpse that looks like it is about to take your hand. The Capuchin catacombs remain one of Sicily's most visited sites, both for history and horror. For some, it is a morbid curiosity. For others, it is a spiritual lesson. But for many, it is simply disturbing. After all, most cemeteries keep the dead underground. Here, the dead line the walls, their grins fixed, their postures strange, as if mocking the living who walk past them. And maybe that is the scariest part. Not that the dead are preserved, not even that they appear to dance, but that when you leave the catacombs, you can't shake the feeling that some of those empty eyes are still watching you, waiting for you to return. Imagine a small New England village in the winter of 1692. Snow piles against wooden cottages, smoke rises from stone chimneys, and the wind howls through the trees. Salem, Massachusetts was a tight-knit community where faith ruled daily life, where everyone's actions were measured against Scripture, and where suspicion often lurked just beneath the surface. It was here, in this fragile world, that whispers of witchcraft exploded into one of the most infamous episodes of mass hysteria in American history. It began quietly, almost innocently. A group of young girls started behaving strangely, screaming, convulsing, claiming invisible spirits were tormenting them. At first, neighbors thought it was sickness, but soon, the girls accused local women of bewitching them. Fear spread like wildfire, and in a town where people already feared the devil's influence, the accusations were enough to turn suspicion into panic. Picture yourself living there. Your neighbor is accused. You see her dragged into court, trembling as she swears she has never consorted with the devil. The girls point their fingers, shrieking that her spirit is attacking them even inside the courtroom. The judges nod gravely. The minister preaches about sin, and the crowd murmurs that perhaps the devil has finally reached Salem. How long before someone points at you? Over 200 people were accused of witchcraft. Families were torn apart. Once respected neighbors became pariahs overnight. Men and women were jailed, chained in freezing cells, forced to confess sins they never committed. 19 people were hanged. One man, Giles Corey, refused to plead guilty or innocent, knowing that either answer would condemn him. Instead, he was pressed to death under heavy stones, his last words chillingly defiant, "More weight." The trials were a grotesque blend of superstition, fear, and manipulation. Some villagers used the chaos to settle old grudges, accusing rivals to seize their land or silence their enemies. Others truly believed they were purging their town of evil. But the line between faith and fear blurred, until it was impossible to tell justice from murder. And here's the disturbing question. If you had lived in Salem, what would you have done? Would you have joined the chorus of accusations to protect yourself? Would you have stayed silent, praying no one noticed you? Or would you have spoken out, knowing full well that courage might send you to the gallows? There is a bitter humor in the absurdity of it all. Imagine a courtroom where spectral evidence was accepted, claims that a person's ghost or spirit had been seen hurting others, even if their body was elsewhere. By that logic, anyone could be guilty of anything. It is like trying to prove someone guilty today, because they haunted your dream. Yet in Salem, such testimony sealed fates. Modern historians have offered explanations. Some point to ergot poisoning, the same fungus suspected in the dancing plague, causing hallucinations. Others blame repressive Puritan culture, where fear of sin turned into paranoia. Still others see it as a power struggle, where the young, powerless girls suddenly held the lives of adults in their hands. Science and sociology offer theories, but none erase the horror of real people hanged from real ropes. The Salem Witch Trials remind us of the fragility of justice when fear is in control, and the echoes are not confined to the past. Even today, societies fall into similar patterns: mass hysteria, scapegoating, blind belief in accusations without evidence. Salem is not just history. It is a warning. Close your eyes and picture it one last time. A cold New England morning, the gallows rising against a gray sky, the crowd hushed as another victim climbs the scaffold. The rope tightens, the body falls, and the crowd exhales a sigh of grim satisfaction. Then they go home, convinced they have done God's work, never realizing they have carved tragedy into the very soul of their town. Imagine walking through a medieval city in the year 1347. The streets are narrow, lined with wooden houses leaning at odd angles, their upper floors nearly touching across the cobblestones. The smell of bread from the bakeries mixes with the stench of waste tossed from windows. But beneath the familiar sounds of merchants and church bells, a new sound begins to rise, coughing, gasping, the shuffle of footsteps that seem weaker than they should. The Black Death had arrived, and nothing in Europe would ever be the same. The plague came quietly at first, carried by ships from the east. Rats infested with fleas brought the disease ashore, and soon towns and villages began to wither. What started as a few strange deaths turned into an unstoppable tide. Within just a few years, the plague killed as many as 25 million people in Europe, nearly 1/3 of the population. Imagine that: 1 out of every 3 faces you know, gone. Entire families wiped out, whole villages abandoned, cities reduced to silence. The symptoms were terrifying: fever, chills, vomiting, and the swelling of lymph nodes into black, painful lumps, buboes. Victims often died within days, their bodies marked by dark blotches that gave the plague its name. Picture yourself waking one morning to find those black marks on your skin, knowing with certainty that your days, perhaps even your hours, were numbered. Fear turned neighbors against each other. Parents abandoned sick children. Priests refused last rites. Doctors fled in terror. Some people locked themselves in their homes, praying the disease would pass them by. Others joined wild processions of flagellants, whipping their backs bloody in public squares, believing the plague was punishment from God. Desperation spread faster than the disease itself. There is a grim humor to how people tried to protect themselves. Some carried flowers and herbs, hoping the sweet smells would ward off illness. That is where the children's rhyme "Ring Around the Rosie" is said to come from. A pocket full of posies, ashes, ashes, we all fall down. Even centuries later, the rhyme carries the echo of a pandemic that haunted childhoods with death. Now place yourself in that world. What would you have done? Locked your doors, praying the stench would not creep through the cracks? Would you have fled to the countryside, only to discover the plague had already arrived there? Or perhaps joined the flagellants, hoping your pain might bargain with God? Imagine the crushing helplessness of living in a time when no cure, no explanation, no comfort could stop the horror. Science today tells us the plague was caused by Yersinia pestis, a bacterium spread by fleas on rats. But even with this knowledge, the fear it unleashed still lingers in history. The plague reshaped Europe, shattering economies, collapsing feudal systems, and even changing art and literature. Skeletons and grim reapers appeared in paintings, a stark reminder that death was never far away. And yet, amid the devastation, something unexpected happened. Survivors gained power. With so many dead, labor became scarce. Peasants demanded better wages, women found new roles in society, and old hierarchies cracked. It is disturbing to think that one of the darkest tragedies in history also paved the way for profound change. Out of death, new life emerged, but only for those who endured. Perhaps the most chilling part of the Black Death is how quickly it spread. One sneeze, one flea bite, one ship docking in a harbor, and an entire town could be doomed. It reminds us even now, in an age of medicine and science, how fragile human life can be against invisible enemies. And when you hear of modern pandemics, perhaps a small echo of that medieval terror stirs inside you. So close your eyes and picture it. A cart rolling down a silent street, the driver ringing a bell and calling, "Bring out your dead." Bodies are stacked high, covered in cloth, carried to mass graves. The city is hushed, save for the cries of the dying and the cawing of crows overhead. That was Europe in the 14th century, an entire continent held hostage by a plague that spared no one. Imagine the grand castles of 16th century Hungary, stone walls rising above misty forests, banners fluttering in the wind, and behind those walls, secrets darker than any battlefield. In one of those castles lived Countess Elizabeth Báthory, a woman whose name would become synonymous with cruelty, blood, and horror. History remembers her not as a noble woman, but as the Blood Countess, accused of bathing in the blood of virgins to preserve her youth. Whether myth or truth, her story remains one of the most disturbing in European history. Elizabeth Báthory was born in 1560 to one of the most powerful families in Hungary. She was wealthy, educated, fluent in multiple languages, a rarity for women of her time. But behind the refinement, there were whispers of cruelty even in her youth. Servants reported sudden fits of rage, punishments that seemed excessive, and a fascination with the suffering of others. When she married Count Ferenc Nadasdy, a soldier known as the Black Hero of Hungary, her violent tendencies only grew sharper. After her husband's death, the Countess ruled her estates with iron authority. And this is where the legend takes its darkest turn. According to testimony from servants and villagers, Elizabeth began luring young peasant girls to her castle, promising them work or education. But once inside, the girls vanished. Rumors spread of torture chambers hidden in the castle's depths, iron instruments, whips, and cruel experiments. Some accounts claim she bit her victims, tore their flesh with needles, or exposed them to freezing cold until they perished. The most infamous rumor says that one day, while striking a servant girl, Elizabeth noticed that a drop of blood had splashed onto her skin. She thought her flesh looked fresher, younger. From then on, she allegedly sought to bathe in blood, believing it would grant eternal beauty. The image of the Countess stepping into a tub of crimson, surrounded by terrified servants, has haunted imaginations for centuries. Was it vanity turned monstrous, or propaganda turned legend? In 1610, Hungarian authorities finally acted. A group of officials raided the castle and claimed to find bodies, some dead, some dying, others chained and mutilated. Witnesses testified against her, and the numbers were staggering. Some said she killed dozens, others claimed hundreds. One servant under interrogation alleged that over 600 girls had died at her hands. Even if the number was exaggerated, the horror remained undeniable. But here's the unsettling twist. Elizabeth Báthory was never executed. Because of her noble blood and powerful family connections, the court avoided a public trial that might embarrass the aristocracy. Instead, she was confined to her castle, bricked into her chambers with only small slits for food and air. For 4 years she lived entombed in her own fortress, until her death in 1614. Imagine pacing the same dark room every day, the screams of victims echoing in memory, the walls closing in like judgment. Historians still debate the truth. Some argue she was the victim of a political conspiracy, targeted by nobles eager to seize her wealth and lands. They claim the testimonies against her were coerced, exaggerated, or fabricated. Others believe the sheer weight of accusations, combined with physical evidence, cannot be dismissed. Was she a monstrous murderer, or a woman destroyed by enemies who turned rumor into legend? Regardless of the answer, her story has seeped into culture. Tales of vampires in Eastern Europe often carry echoes of Báthory. Bram Stoker's Dracula was inspired not only by Vlad the Impaler, but also by whispers of the Countess who bathed in blood. Horror films, novels, and folklore continue to resurrect her image, pale, beautiful, and cruel, standing in a crimson bath that will never wash her sins away. Now ask yourself, if you were a peasant in 16th century Hungary, would you have risked entering the Countess's castle for a promise of work, or would you have stayed far away, knowing whispers of girls who never returned? And if you lived near the castle, hearing screams at night carried on the wind, would you have dared speak out or stayed silent, fearing you would be next? There is a dark humor, in the absurdity of it all. Imagine Elizabeth Báthory anxiously checking for wrinkles, then deciding the solution was buckets of blood. It is grotesque, it is ridiculous, and yet it is terrifying because enough people believed it could be true. Sometimes history is scarier than fiction, precisely because it balances on that edge between the believable and the absurd. The Blood Countess remains a disturbing reminder of power unchecked. Whether guilty of hundreds of murders or a victim of slander, her story shows how fear, rumor, and cruelty can combine to create a legend that still chills us today. Imagine the vast American frontier of the 1840s, endless plains stretching beneath a sky that seemed too wide to belong to this world. Mountains looming in the distance like walls no one had yet dared to climb, and wagons creaking westward as families dreamed of a new life in California. Among those who set out was a group later remembered not for their hope, but for their horror, the Donner Party. Their story is one of hunger, desperation, and choices so dark that they still unsettle America's memory. The Donner Party began as an ordinary migration. In April 1846, nearly 90 men, women, and children left Illinois with wagons loaded with supplies. They followed the promise of the California Trail, part of the great westward expansion that drew thousands. But ambition often blinds judgment. The Donners chose to take a shortcut called the Hastings Cutoff, a route promoted as faster but in reality untested and treacherous. It led them through deserts where water was scarce and mountains where the wagons barely fit. Weeks were lost, supplies dwindled, and tensions grew. By October, snow began to fall in the Sierra Nevada. The wagons became trapped, hemmed in by walls of ice and snow that reached higher than the tallest man. Imagine being stuck in the wilderness with winter closing in, your children shivering, your food running out. They built makeshift cabins near what is now Donner Lake, hoping to wait out the season. But the storms grew relentless, and the food disappeared faster than hope. At first, they ate what little livestock remained. Then ox hides, boiled into leather soup so tough and bitter that even chewing it felt like despair. And then came the unthinkable. When people began to die, their bodies were used as food. It was not murder, but survival. The diaries of survivors record the grim meals: flesh carved in silence, bones cracked for marrow, prayers whispered over the unholy act of eating a neighbor to stay alive. Now imagine yourself there. Would you have done the same, faced with starving children, your body too weak to walk? Would you refuse, clinging to dignity even as you wasted away? Or would you have crossed that line, convincing yourself that survival justified anything? It is easy to judge from comfort, but in the snowbound cabins of the Donner Party, morality froze alongside everything else. Not everyone survived. Of the original 90, nearly half perished. Rescue parties from California eventually reached them, but even salvation came slowly in waves. Some survivors were carried out, skeletal and hollow-eyed, while others were left behind until more rescuers could return. Those who lived never forgot. Some refused to speak of it again. Others, when questioned, insisted they had not eaten human flesh, though evidence suggested otherwise. Shame clung to them like frost, refusing to melt even in the warmth of spring. There is a bitter irony to their ordeal. The so-called Hastings Cutoff, the shortcut that led them to disaster, had been nothing more than an arrogant salesman's idea, an untested path pushed by Lansford Hastings to make himself famous. His name is remembered not for glory, but for leading men, women, and children into the jaws of starvation. The Donner Party's story became legend in America. Newspapers sensationalized it, whispering about cannibalism and madness in the mountains. To this day, the name Donner conjures both pity and dread. But beyond the shock, their tragedy reveals something uncomfortable: how thin the line between civilization and savagery truly is. One season of snow, one misstep in planning, and ordinary families became the authors of one of the darkest chapters of westward expansion. There is even a strange humor in how the tale is remembered. Tourist signs near Donner Lake today tell the story as though it were folklore, almost like a ghost story to entertain road trippers. Imagine families eating ice cream by the lake, reading plaques that describe how, in that very spot, desperate pioneers once boiled human bones for food. It is morbid, absurd, and yet it reminds us that history never hides for long. In the end, The Donner Party is not just a story of hunger. It is a mirror. It forces us to confront our own instincts, to ask what we would do when stripped of comfort, law, and morality. Would we endure nobly or survive shamefully? There is no answer that feels safe. That is why, even today, the name Donner lingers like a shadow on the American frontier. Imagine a city under siege in the winter of 1937. Nanking, the capital of China at the time, had already suffered the thunder of artillery, the collapse of walls, the screams of civilians fleeing through narrow alleys. But what followed after the Japanese Imperial Army entered the city is remembered not as war, but as atrocity. The Nanking Massacre, sometimes called the Rape of Nanking. It was not simply battle. It was a nightmare lived by hundreds of thousands of innocent people. The numbers alone stagger the mind. Historians estimate that in just 6 weeks, between 200,000 and 300,000 civilians and unarmed soldiers were killed. Tens of thousands of women were raped, often in front of their families, sometimes killed afterward to erase the evidence. Men, women, children, the elderly, no one was spared. Imagine your city, your neighbors, your family subjected to that scale of brutality, and the world powerless to intervene. Eyewitness accounts describe streets littered with bodies, rivers choked with corpses, and the air heavy with the stench of death. Soldiers turned homes into torture chambers. Some victims were stabbed with bayonets, others burned alive, and still others used for grotesque practice as soldiers competed in killing contests. The cruelty was not random, it became systematic, as though humanity itself had been erased. Now ask yourself, what would you have done if you lived there? If soldiers broke into your home, would you fight back, knowing resistance meant instant death? Would you try to hide, praying the footsteps past your door? Or would you step into the streets, hoping surrender might buy mercy that never came? There was no right answer, only survival or silence. Even amid the horror, there were fragments of humanity. A group of Westerners, including missionaries and businessmen, created the Nanking Safety Zone, sheltering tens of thousands of civilians. John Robb, a German businessman and member of the Nazi Party, became an unlikely protector, using his status to shield the vulnerable. Imagine the bitter irony. A man tied to one of history's darkest regimes, saving lives from another. It reminds us that morality is rarely simple in war. There is a grotesque absurdity, too. Some soldiers posed for photographs with their victims, smiling as if the massacre were sport. Others kept diaries boasting of the crimes. These records became evidence decades later, but in the moment, they were chilling proof of how ordinary men could become monsters. History forces us to confront that disturbing truth. Evil is not always a shadowy figure in the dark. Sometimes it wears a uniform and smiles for the camera. The massacre scarred China deeply. Survivors carried the trauma for the rest of their lives, often in silence. Families lost generations, women bore shame and stigma, and children grew up haunted by the memory of screams and blood. For decades, the subject was suppressed or denied in some quarters, fueling anger and pain that persists even now. And here is the unsettling part. The world allowed it to fade too easily. While trials after World War I condemned some perpetrators, many escaped punishment. Some even returned to normal lives, their crimes buried beneath diplomacy and time. The survivors were left not only with trauma, but with the unbearable knowledge that justice was incomplete. Now close your eyes and imagine walking through the streets of Nanking during those 6 weeks. The air is cold, the city silent except for distant cries. Around each corner lies horror, a family executed, a child wandering alone, soldiers dragging victims away. The massacre is not just numbers in a textbook, it was lived in every heartbeat of those who endured it. There is no humor here, no nervous laughter to soften the blow. Only the chilling realization that civilization is fragile, and under certain conditions, it collapses into barbarity with terrifying speed. The massacre of Nanking is not just a story of the past. It is a warning of what human beings are capable of when hatred and power go unchecked. Chicago, 1893. The city is alive with wonder, hosting the World's Fair that dazzled millions with electric lights, grand architecture, and a vision of modern progress. People came from all over America and beyond to marvel at the future. Yet, only a few blocks away from the fairgrounds, another building stood, a hotel with a grim secret. Locals called it the Murder Castle, and its owner was Dr. H. Holmes, a man whose charm concealed monstrous intent. From the outside, Holmes's building looked like an ordinary hotel, welcoming travelers who came to the fair. But inside, it was a labyrinth of horror. Secret staircases, windowless rooms, trapdoors, and soundproof chambers filled its walls. Some rooms were lined with gas pipes, allowing Holmes to suffocate victims at will. Others contained chutes that led straight to the basement, where furnaces and vats of acid waited. Imagine walking into a hotel, thinking you would found a safe place to rest, only to discover you would checked into a death trap. Holmes presented himself as a doctor and a gentleman. He was charming, intelligent, and persuasive, qualities that lured many women, particularly young ones seeking work or adventure in the big city. He offered them jobs, promises of stability, or even marriage. Instead, many disappeared within the castle's walls, their fate sealed by Holmes's cunning. The victims were countless. Some estimates suggest dozens, while Holmes himself, under interrogation, claimed he killed over 200. Historians believe the true number was likely lower, but still staggering. Bodies were dissected, skeletons sold to medical schools, and remains destroyed in his basement furnaces. Holmes profited not only from murder, but also from the grim business of turning human lives into commodities. And here's the disturbing part: no one suspected at first. Guests came and went, employees worked without understanding the building's design, and the city bustled on as if nothing unusual was happening. The fairgrounds a few streets away celebrated innovation and humanity's brightest future, while Holmes's castle embodied the darkest shadow of human imagination. Now ask yourself, what would you have done if you had been a guest there? You check in, greeted by Holmes's polite smile. You climb the stairs only to find your room has no windows. The lock clicks behind you. The air grows heavy. Do you pound on the door, scream for help, or do you sit frozen, realizing too late that you have stepped into a carefully designed coffin? There is a dark humor in the sheer audacity of it all. Holmes was not hiding in the woods like a monster of folklore. He built a hotel right in the middle of a booming city, designed entirely around murder. It is like if someone combined a haunted house with a business plan, and people came willingly, handing over money for the privilege of entering his trap. When Holmes was finally caught, it was not initially for murder but for insurance fraud. But as investigators dug deeper, they uncovered the terrifying reality of the castle. The trial shocked the nation. Newspapers labeled him a beast, a devil in human form. In court, Holmes confessed with chilling calm, claiming, "I was born with the devil in me." He seemed almost amused by the horror he had created, as if he relished his role in America's nightmares. In 1896, Holmes was executed by hanging. Witnesses said he remained calm to the end, his expression serene even as the noose tightened. But his legend only grew. The murder castle was demolished, but its memory lingers in every tale of serial killers, every horror story about hotels, every uneasy glance at a locked door in a strange room. Think about this. While the World's Fair celebrated humanity's brightest achievements, just down the street, one man constructed a monument to cruelty, progress, and horror, standing side by side, each reflecting the extremes of what humans can create. The Murder Castle of H. Holmes is a chilling reminder that evil does not always hide in shadows. Sometimes it builds walls, rents rooms, and welcomes you with a smile. Imagine the Atlantic Ocean in December 1872. The water stretches endlessly, cold and gray, the horizon blurring into a winter sky. On the waves drifts a ship, Mary Celeste. Her sails are partly set, her hull steady, and the vessel looks as though it should be carrying life. But when another ship, the Dei Gratia, approaches, the truth is revealed: Mary Celeste is empty. Her crew has vanished. The discovery baffled sailors. There was no sign of struggle, no blood on the decks, no bodies floating nearby. The cargo, 1,700 barrels of industrial alcohol, was intact. The ship's provisions were plentiful, food and water enough for 6 months. Even the crew's personal belongings remained neatly stored. It looked as if everyone had simply stepped off the vessel mid-journey. disappearing into the sea without explanation. Captain Benjamin Briggs, his wife Sarah, and their 2-year-old daughter Sophia had been aboard, along with 7 crewmen. They left New York bound for Genoa, Italy, in good spirits. Briggs was experienced, disciplined, and deeply respected. So how does a seasoned captain abandon a seaworthy ship that is the heart of the Mary Celeste mystery? Some theories suggest pirates, but there were no signs of looting. Money, jewelry, even valuables were untouched. Others imagine mutiny, yet the crew was carefully chosen and loyal, with no evidence of conflict. Could it have been weather? Perhaps a waterspout or sudden squall frightened the captain into ordering evacuation. But if so, why leave behind documents, navigation tools, and lifeboats poorly provisioned for survival? One of the most chilling theories involves the cargo itself. Some believe fumes from the alcohol barrels leaked, creating the illusion of imminent explosion. If Briggs feared the ship might ignite, he may have ordered everyone into the lifeboat temporarily, only for disaster to strike as they drifted away, never to return. Picture the irony. A cautious decision meant to save lives becomes the very cause of their deaths. And then there are stranger explanations. Some whisper of sea monsters, of giant squids pulling sailors overboard. Others imagine alien abduction, an eerie narrative that modern audiences still find oddly appealing. Still others suggest supernatural forces, that Mary Celeste was cursed, a wandering ghost ship destined to sail without her crew. Now, put yourself on that ship for a moment. You wake one morning to silence, no footsteps, no laughter, no voices. The galley is stocked, the beds neatly made, but every person you knew has vanished. Do you dare explore the empty cabins, or do you jump overboard, certain something unseen stalks the decks? Which fear is greater, the unknown within or the endless sea without? There is a dark humor in how the story spread. Newspapers exaggerated, inventing lurid tales of bloodstains and half-eaten meals left on tables. Readers devoured the mystery, turning tragedy into entertainment. Even Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, creator of Sherlock Holmes, wrote a fictionalized version, imagining supernatural forces at work. The Mary Celeste became less a shipwreck and more a legend, her ghostly sails drifting through culture as much as through the Atlantic. But the fact remains, the crew was never found. No remains washed ashore, no lifeboat discovered. It was as if the ocean swallowed them whole, erasing their existence but leaving their vessel behind as a taunt. The ship itself continued to sail for years, changing owners but never shedding its reputation as cursed. In 1885, she was deliberately wrecked in an insurance scam, her remains resting beneath Caribbean waters, a fittingly strange end for a ship that had carried one of history's greatest mysteries. The ghost ship Mary Celeste reminds us that the sea, for all its beauty, is vast, merciless, and secretive. Even today, with satellites and GPS, ships vanish without explanation. When you look out over the ocean, remember, sometimes the water does not give back what it takes. Picture the cold waters of San Francisco Bay in June 1962. The moon hangs faintly above the Golden Gate, and the waves slap against jagged rocks. In the distance, Alcatraz Island rises like a fortress, a place the U.S. government claimed was inescapable. The Rock, as it was called, held some of the nation's most dangerous criminals. Yet on one fateful night, 3 inmates vanished, leaving behind one of the greatest mysteries in American crime history. The escapees were Frank Morris and brothers John and Clarence Anglin. All 3 had long criminal records, but also remarkable intelligence and patience. For months they chipped away at the walls of their cells with makeshift tools, spoons stolen from the cafeteria, drills fashioned from vacuum cleaner motors. They concealed the holes with painted cardboard, fooling guards who never looked closely. The plan was as bold as it was meticulous. But tools were not enough. The men also built life-size dummy heads out of plaster, flesh-toned paint, and real human hair smuggled from the prison barbershop. On the night of June 11th, they placed the heads in their beds to trick guards into thinking they were asleep. Then, slipping through the holes in their cells, they climbed utility corridors, scaled barbed wire fences, and reached the shore. There, they inflated a raft and life vests they had made from over 50 stolen raincoats. Imagine the scene, 3 figures pushing their fragile raft into the freezing black water, paddling desperately toward freedom. The next morning, guards discovered the empty cells. The dummy heads were so convincing that one guard reportedly tried to wake a sleeping prisoner. By the time the alarm rang, the men were gone. A massive manhunt followed. Boats scoured the bay, helicopters swept the coastline, and FBI agents pieced together every detail. But no bodies were ever found. Authorities declared that the men likely drowned. The bay's waters are frigid, the current swift, and the distance to shore daunting. Officially, the escape was ruled unsuccessful. Yet doubts linger. No remains surfaced, no clothing washed ashore, no definitive proof of death emerged. For decades, rumors spread that the Anglin brothers made it to South America, that Morris lived under a false identity, that sightings occurred in Brazil or Florida years later. Families even claimed to receive postcards and photographs from the fugitives. Now place yourself in that cell. The walls are damp, the air smells of salt and rust, and you hear guards' footsteps echoing down the corridor. Would you dare scrape at the concrete night after night, risking discovery? Would you paddle into an icy current that has claimed strong swimmers? Would you trust a raft sewn from raincoats to carry your life? What is freedom worth when the price may be death in the dark? There is a strange humor in the ingenuity of it all. Imagine hardened criminals hunched over arts and crafts projects, sewing raincoats together like desperate tailors, or carefully painting plaster heads with stolen brushes. It sounds absurd, almost cartoonish, until you realize it worked, at least well enough to fool the guards and reach the water. The mystery endures because it refuses resolution. In 2013, the FBI received a letter allegedly from John Anglin, claiming he had survived and was seeking medical help in exchange for surrender. Experts debated its authenticity, but the possibility reignited fascination. Could the rock's reputation as inescapable have been shattered after all? Today, tourists visit Alcatraz and hear the tale, standing in front of the very cells the men escaped from. The holes in the walls, the dummy heads, and the raincoat raft are displayed like museum pieces. It is eerie to imagine you are standing in the same spot where men once gambled everything on one desperate swim. The Alcatraz escape mystery remains unsolved. Did they drown, their bodies pulled silently into the Pacific, or did they vanish into new lives, smiling in the shadows at having beaten the system? Perhaps the truth lies beneath the waves, or perhaps it lingers in a hidden village far from the rock. Picture the frozen wilderness of the Ural Mountains in February 1959. The landscape is bleak, snow stretching endlessly under a pale moon, icy winds cutting through the trees, and silence so heavy it feels alive. In this desolate place, 9 experienced hikers from the Ural Polytechnic Institute set out on a ski expedition. They were young, strong, skilled in survival. Yet days later, searchers found their campsite abandoned, their tent ripped open from the inside, and their bodies scattered across the snow. What happened on Dyatlov Pass remains one of history's most haunting mysteries. The group was led by Igor Dyatlov, a disciplined and capable student. With him were 8 others, each with mountaineering experience. They had planned a challenging but achievable trek. Their diaries, recovered later, revealed excitement, laughter, and camaraderie. Nothing suggested disaster, but on the night of February 1st, something went terribly wrong. Rescue teams discovered the hikers' tent half buried in snow, slashed open, not from outside intrusion, but from within, as if the group had desperately clawed their way out. Their boots and coats were left behind, even though temperatures plunged to -30°C. Footprints led away from the tent, barefoot in socks or wearing only one shoe, trailing into the forest. It was as if panic had driven them into the freezing night without protection. The bodies were found in stages. 2 lay near a fire pit under a cedar tree, stripped to their underwear, their hands burned as if they had tried to cling to the flames. 3 more were discovered between the tree and the tent, frozen in poses suggesting they were crawling back for warmth. Months later, the remaining 4 were found in a ravine. These last bodies revealed injuries so severe that investigators were stunned. Fractured skulls, broken ribs, and internal trauma described as equal to a car crash. Yet strangely, no external wounds matched the damage, as though the force came from within. To add to the mystery, traces of radiation were found on some of the victims' clothing. Their skin appeared unusually dark, their hair tinged with gray. Eyewitnesses at the funerals reported the corpses looked as though they had been exposed to something unnatural. Explanations swirled. Some claimed it was an avalanche, forcing the hikers to flee the tent. But experts argue the slope was too shallow, and the injuries inconsistent. Others suggested military testing, secret weapons, parachute mines, or radiation experiments gone wrong. Conspiracy theories pointed to UFOs, citing strange lights seen in the sky that same night. Still others blamed local Mansi tribes, though no evidence supported an attack. Now ask yourself, if you were in that tent hearing a noise outside, would you have cut your way out in panic? Would you run barefoot into the snow? Knowing death waited in minutes, what terror could drive 9 skilled hikers to abandon reason so completely? There is a grim absurdity, too. Imagine young students joking in their diaries one day, only to be found months later in conditions so bizarre that investigators could barely describe them. The juxtaposition is chilling, laughter frozen into mystery. The Soviet investigation at the time concluded simply that the hikers died due to a compelling natural force. No further explanation was given. Files were sealed, rumors spread, and the Dyatlov Pass incident entered legend. In 2019, Russian authorities reopened the case, eventually attributing the deaths to a rare type of avalanche. But skeptics remain unconvinced, pointing to the lack of consistent evidence. Today, Dyatlov Pass is both a memorial and a riddle. Hikers visit the site, leaving flowers by the memorial stone bearing 9 names. The mountain itself was renamed Dyatlov Pass in their honor. And yet when the wind howls across the snow, one can almost imagine the final screams carried on the air, echoes of a night when fear triumphed over survival. The Dyatlov Pass incident remains unsolved, not just because of what happened, but because of how it makes us feel. It reminds us that even the strongest, the smartest, and the most prepared are vulnerable to forces we cannot understand. Picture a vast stretch of ocean between Miami, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico. The water sparkles under the tropical sun, waves rolling gently as if nothing could ever go wrong. Yet this region, covering some 500,000 square miles, has earned a name that chills sailors and pilots alike, the Bermuda Triangle. For decades, stories of ships and planes vanishing without a trace have turned this patch of paradise into one of history's most unsettling mysteries. One of the most famous cases is Flight 19. On December 5, 1945, 5 U.S. Navy bombers set out on a training mission from Florida. Hours later, radio transmissions revealed confusion. The pilots could not recognize landmarks, their compasses spun wildly, and fuel ran low. Their commander's last words were haunting: "We can't tell where we are. Everything looks wrong." The planes vanished, and a rescue aircraft sent to find them disappeared as well. No wreckage was ever found. Ships too have vanished. The USS Cyclops, a massive Navy cargo ship, disappeared in 1918 with more than 300 men aboard. No distress call, no debris, just silence. Smaller vessels, from private yachts to fishing boats, have vanished in calm seas, often without leaving so much as a floating plank. Imagine waving goodbye to loved ones at a harbor, only for their vessel to slip into the triangle and never return. Theories abound. Some point to violent weather, sudden storms, rogue waves, or waterspouts that can swallow ships whole. Others highlight magnetic anomalies, where compasses misbehave and navigation becomes impossible. Scientists have suggested methane gas eruptions from the ocean floor could reduce water's buoyancy, causing ships to sink instantly. Pilots speak of electronic interference, radar blackouts, or time distortions. And of course, there are the more fantastic explanations: alien abductions, underwater pyramids, or portals to another dimension. Now, place yourself in that cockpit or on that deck. Your compass spins, the horizon looks unfamiliar, and the radio crackles with static. Do you stay calm, trusting your instruments, or do you feel dread rise, certain that you have entered a place where the rules of nature no longer apply? The Bermuda Triangle is not just about vanishing ships. It is about the fear of losing control, of realizing that even technology can fail against forces we do not understand. There is a strange humor in how the triangle has become pop culture. Cartoon characters sail into it and reappear in bizarre places. Tourist shops sell t-shirts with slogans like, "I survived the Bermuda Triangle." Cruise ships even advertise voyages through it, as if daring fate. It is absurd, really. People paying extra to cross waters, rumored to swallow travelers whole. Yet behind the jokes lies real tragedy. Families never received closure, sailors never returned home, and pilots vanished into the blue. Even if science explains much of it, storms, human error, or equipment failure, the pattern of disappearances keeps the legend alive. Because sometimes, mystery refuses to be fully explained. Today, the Bermuda Triangle continues to draw fascination. Some scientists argue there is nothing statistically unusual about the disappearances. It is simply one of the world's busiest shipping lanes. Others insist the legend endures because it feeds a deep human craving, to believe there are still places where the unknown lurks waiting. Close your eyes and imagine sailing those waters. The sea is calm, the sky is clear. But then your compass begins to spin, the radio goes silent and the horizon wavers. A chill creeps over you, not from the wind, but from the thought that perhaps you have entered a place where the ocean itself swallows secrets. That is the Bermuda Triangle. Not just a place on a map, but a shadow on the imagination. Imagine a hot summer day in July 1518 in the city of Strasbourg, then part of the Holy Roman Empire. The streets are crowded with merchants, bakers, and children playing in the dust. Suddenly, a woman named Frau Trophia steps into the square and begins to dance. There is no music, no festival, no reason. Yet she sways and spins, her arms flailing, her feet stomping the cobblestones. Hours pass, and she does not stop. Days pass, and she is still moving, her body trembling with exhaustion, but her feet compelled to keep going. Soon, dozens join her. Then hundreds. The city had been struck by what history now calls the Dancing Plague of 1518. It sounds absurd, almost comical, a city cursed to dance itself to death. But the accounts are grim. Chroniclers reported that within a month, as many as 400 people were dancing uncontrollably in the streets. Some collapsed from exhaustion. Others suffered strokes or heart attacks. A few literally danced themselves to death. Imagine walking into the marketplace, only to find crowds of neighbors convulsing to an invisible rhythm, their faces twisted with agony, unable to stop. Authorities were baffled. At first, they encouraged the dancing, believing it was some kind of illness that could only be cured by letting it burn out. Musicians were hired, stages built, and space cleared for the afflicted to move. But the plan backfired. Music only fueled the frenzy, and more citizens joined, their bodies overtaken by the mysterious compulsion. The city descended into chaos, its people trapped in a grotesque parody of joy. What caused it, historians still debate. One theory blames ergot poisoning, the same toxic fungus that grows on rye and produces hallucinations. If citizens ate contaminated bread, they could have suffered spasms and visions. Another theory suggests mass hysteria, triggered by the crushing stress of famine, disease, and religious fear. In 1518, Strasbourg was racked by poverty and despair. Perhaps the dancing was a collective release, the body rebelling against hopelessness in the only way it could, movement without end. And then there are stranger explanations. Some saw it as divine punishment, sent by saints angered at the city's sins. Others believed it was demonic possession. Even now the image lingers, a crowd spinning and stomping in the blazing sun, their screams and laughter echoing through the narrow streets, as if invisible strings pulled them. Now ask yourself, if you had lived there, and your neighbors began dancing uncontrollably, what would you have done? Would you have joined, hoping to purge yourself of whatever curse gripped the city? Would you have locked your doors, praying the madness passed you by? Or would you have stood watching, unable to decide whether to laugh, cry, or tremble? There is a dark humor in the absurdity. Imagine city officials paying for musicians, not to celebrate, but to soundtrack mass suffering. Picture a city square full of citizens moving like puppets, collapsing one by one, while the fiddles kept playing. It is grotesque, but it is also absurdly theatrical, like a nightmare staged as a carnival. The plague eventually faded after several weeks, though no one knows exactly how. Some dancers were taken to shrines, prayed over, and slowly recovered. Others never returned home. The city buried its dead and tried to forget, but the story lived on, retold in whispers and chronicles as one of the strangest events in history. The dancing plague of 1518 reminds us of how fragile the human mind and body can be, especially under the weight of collective stress. It also reminds us that history is not always dignified or solemn. Sometimes it is bizarre, terrifying, and tinged with comedy. Imagine being cursed not to fight, not to starve, not to flee, but to dance endlessly, until your body gives out. Picture London in September 1666. The city is alive with the smell of bread baking, the chatter of merchants, and the clatter of hooves on narrow cobbled streets. Houses are crowded together, their timber frames dry after a hot summer. It is a city of energy, but also of danger. A spark could turn it into an inferno. And on the night of September 2nd, in the bakery of Thomas Farriner on Pudding Lane, that spark was struck. By morning, London was burning. The fire spread with terrifying speed. Strong winds carried flames from roof to roof, turning houses into torches. Within hours, entire streets collapsed into embers. Citizens fled with whatever they could carry, chests, children, even pets tucked under their arms. Samuel Pepys, the famous diarist, described people wading through the Thames with their belongings on boats, desperate to escape the heat. By the time the fire was contained 4 days later, nearly 13,000 homes, 87 churches, and countless shops were gone. The heart of medieval London had been reduced to ash. The blaze consumed landmarks. Street. Paul's Cathedral, built of stone, was thought indestructible, but its lead roof melted, pouring down the streets like rivers of fire. Imagine standing at a distance, watching flames leap higher than the towers while bells crashed from the heat. The destruction was not only physical, it was spiritual, as if the city itself had been humbled by forces beyond control. What caused the devastation? Some blamed the bakery, others foreign conspirators. In the tense atmosphere of the time, rumors swirled that the French or Dutch had set the blaze. An innocent French watchmaker was executed after falsely confessing. In truth, the fire likely spread simply because London was a tinderbox. Wooden houses crammed together, narrow lanes acting as funnels for the flames, and no organized fire brigade to stop it. Now put yourself in those narrow streets. You hear the roar of fire behind you, the crack of beams collapsing, the cries of neighbors. Do you stay to defend your home, pouring buckets of water that vanish into the flames, or do you abandon everything, running into the night with nothing but the clothes on your back? What do you choose when the city itself is collapsing around you? There is a strange humor in how Londoners responded. Some buried their valuables in gardens or stuffed them into wells, only to find them destroyed by heat or stolen later. Pepys famously buried his wine and even his cheese in the ground, hoping to save them. Imagine future archaeologists unearthing a lump of melted cheddar and wondering at its significance. The fire's devastation was immense, but it also reshaped the city. Out of the ashes came rebuilding. Sir Christopher Wren designed a new street. Paul's Cathedral, grander and stronger. Wider streets were laid out, brick and stone replaced timber, and fire regulations were introduced. The London we know today, ordered, monumental, enduring, was born from those flames. But the human cost remains haunting. Though official records claimed surprisingly few deaths, many believe the toll was far higher, with poor and unrecorded citizens lost in the blaze. Their names are gone, but their suffering lingers in the memory of the fire. The Great Fire of London is both a tragedy and a transformation. It reminds us that destruction can clear the way for renewal, but also that human lives can vanish as easily as sparks in the wind. When you walk the streets of London today, under the shadow of modern skyscrapers, remember that once the city itself was a sea of fire, and its people faced a choice between loss and survival. Picture a small Puritan village in Massachusetts in the year 1692. The streets are muddy, the houses plain, and the people strict in their faith. It is a community bound by religion, suspicion, and fear of the devil. One cold winter, young girls begin to twitch, scream, and fall into strange fits. They claim they are tormented by invisible forces. The adults, steeped in superstition, reach a terrifying conclusion. Witches walk among them. And so begins the Salem Witch Trials, one of the darkest chapters in American history. The accusations spread quickly. Neighbors turned on neighbors, pointing fingers at those they disliked or envied. Outsiders, the poor and women who lived independently, became easy targets. Soon, dozens were accused of practicing witchcraft. Courts were convened, and the testimony of hysterical children was accepted as evidence. Imagine standing in front of your town, watching a child scream that your spirit choked her in the night, and realizing her words could mean your death. The trials grew more grotesque. To prove guilt, authorities demanded confessions. Those who admitted to witchcraft often escaped execution, while those who denied were hanged. It became a cruel paradox: lie and live, or tell the truth and die. 19 people were executed by hanging. One man was pressed to death under heavy stones, and hundreds more were imprisoned in squalid conditions. The methods of evidence were absurd. Spectral evidence, the claim that a victim saw a witch's spirit in dreams or visions, was treated as fact. Simple misfortunes like spoiled milk or a failed crop were blamed on witches. A doll found in a house could be branded a puppet used for curses. In one case, a dog was even executed for supposed witchcraft. Now, place yourself in that village. Your child falls sick, your cow dies, your bread molds. Would you suspect witchcraft? If the community demanded you accuse someone, would you point to your neighbor to protect your family, or would you resist, risking that the accusation might fall on you instead? Fear has a way of twisting morality until survival becomes the only truth. There is dark humor in the hysteria. Imagine stern judges listening solemnly while children claim to fly on broomsticks or speak with the devil. Picture the absurdity of educated men debating whether a sneeze could be proof of sorcery. It was deadly theater, with the courtroom as its stage and human lives as the price of admission. Eventually, reason began to creep back. Ministers and townsfolk started questioning the trials, realizing the madness had gone too far. By 1693, the frenzy subsided and the accused were released. Years later, courts admitted the trials had been a terrible mistake. Families of the victims were given compensation, but no amount of money could undo the terror or restore the lives lost. The Salem Witch Trials endure in memory, not just because of their cruelty, but because they reveal how fear can override justice, how hysteria can warp a community, and how belief in the unseen can destroy the living. Today, Salem embraces its dark history. Tourists visit museums, reenactments are staged, and Halloween brings throngs to the Witch City. Yet beneath the costumes and fun lies the reminder of a tragedy. The trials remind us how quickly suspicion can become violence, how fragile truth can be when fear rules the heart. The Salem Witch Trials are not just about witches. They are about people, ordinary people, driven to extraordinary cruelty by fear. They remind us to question, to doubt, and to resist when panic demands victims. Picture Europe in the mid-14th century. The streets are narrow, the houses cramped, and the air thick with the smell of animals and waste. In this world, death was never far away, but nothing could have prepared humanity for what came in 1347, the arrival of the Black Death. Within just a few years, the plague would wipe out nearly a third of Europe's population, changing history forever. It began with ships arriving in Sicily, carrying not only merchants and goods, but rats crawling with fleas. Those fleas carried Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes plague. From port to port, from village to village, the disease spread like wildfire. Victims developed painful swellings, buboes, blackened skin, fever, vomiting, and death within days. Families collapsed, villages emptied, and entire cities became graveyards. Imagine walking through a medieval town as the plague struck. Bells toll constantly for the dead. Carts roll down the streets piled with corpses. Priests offer last rites in whispers, too afraid to linger near the sick. The smell of death hangs over everything, so thick it feels like breathing poison. Fear seeps into every home, every prayer, every glance at a neighbor's cough. Responses were desperate. Some turned to religion, believing God was punishing humanity's sins. Flagellants marched through towns whipping themselves, hoping to atone. Others turned to scapegoats, blaming outsiders, Jews or strangers, leading to violence and persecution. Doctors, powerless to cure, wore long-beaked masks stuffed with herbs, hoping to filter the miasma. Their strange appearance became an icon of terror itself. Now ask yourself, if you lived then, what would you have done? Would you have fled the city, abandoning loved ones to save yourself? Would you have shut your doors, praying the sickness passed over your house? Or would you have accepted fate, knowing there was no cure, only the waiting shadow of death? There is grim absurdity in some of the cures attempted. People carried posies of flowers to ward off the stench, believing it would protect them. Some drank potions of crushed emeralds or bathed in vinegar. Others believed bathing at all was dangerous and instead let filth accumulate, thinking it would block the disease. Imagine the irony. Attempts at protection sometimes only worsened the spread. The toll was staggering. Between 75 and 200 million people died across Europe, Asia, and North Africa. The social order crumbled. With so many dead, fields went untilled, businesses collapsed, and labor became scarce. Yet from the devastation came change. Survivors demanded higher wages, serfs gained more freedom, and medieval society shifted toward the dawn of the modern age. The plague also left scars in the imagination. Art filled with images of skeletons dancing with the living, the danse macabre, reminding people that death spared no one. Stories and superstitions flourished, shaping culture for centuries. The Black Death was not just a disease. It was a trauma that reshaped Europe's soul. Even today, the Black Death haunts us. Scientists study its DNA, tracing how it evolved. Outbreaks of plague still occur in parts of the world, though now treatable with antibiotics. But the memory of the 14th century remains, a reminder of how fragile life is when nature unleashes its fury. The Black Death teaches us that even in the darkest times, humanity endures. But it also warns that fear and ignorance can be as deadly as the disease itself. Imagine America in 1846. The promise of the West called to settlers, offering fertile land, freedom, and the chance to build a new life. Wagon trains rumbled across plains and mountains, their wheels carving trails into the wilderness. Among these pioneers was the Donner Party, a group of nearly 90 people who set out from Illinois, bound for California. But poor decisions, misfortune, and the brutal hand of winter turned their journey into one of the most harrowing tragedies in American history. The trouble began when the group chose to follow the so-called Hastings Cutoff, a new route advertised as a shortcut. Instead of saving time, it led them into treacherous terrain and endless delays. Mountains slowed their wagons, deserts drained their strength, and tempers flared. By the time they reached the Sierra Nevada, snow was already falling. Soon the passes were blocked by drifts as high as houses. The Donner Party was trapped. For weeks they tried to survive. They slaughtered their oxen, boiled hides, and gnawed on bones. Diaries described chewing on leather straps, just to quiet the pangs of hunger. Children cried themselves to sleep from starvation. Parents watched helplessly as their families weakened. Then came the most disturbing chapter. As food ran out and desperation grew, some turned to cannibalism. Bodies of the dead preserved in the snow became grim sustenance. Survivors later testified to the horror of cutting flesh from friends and relatives, torn between revulsion and the will to live. Imagine sitting by a fire in a snowbound cabin, staring at the body of someone you once shared laughter with, knowing you must eat or die. Rescue parties eventually fought through the snow to reach them, but not all could be saved. Of the nearly 90 who set out, only about half survived. Children lived while parents perished. Brothers were forced to eat brothers. The survivors carried not only scars of hunger, but also the guilt of what they had done to survive. Now ask yourself, if you were there, snow pressing against the windows, your stomach empty for days, your children begging for food, what would you do? Could you make that choice? Could you look at the face of a neighbor and see a meal? Survival in such moments is not heroic, it is monstrous, and yet deeply human. There is grim irony in how the Donner Party is remembered. They sought a shortcut to a better life, only to find themselves taking the longest road through suffering. The name Donner has become synonymous with tragedy, yet also with the cruel lessons of ambition, trust, and survival. Today, visitors can stand at Donner Lake in California, where monuments mark the site of their ordeal. The lake is beautiful, ringed by pines and mountains, its waters calm. But beneath that beauty lies memory, snow, hunger, and desperation echoing across centuries. The Donner Party reminds us that the frontier was not only about hope and freedom. It was also about danger, failure, and the extremes of human endurance. Their story forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about what survival truly costs. Picture a quiet April night in 1986 in the Soviet Union. In the town of Pripyat, workers at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant prepared for a routine safety test. The sky was calm, the air still. But inside Reactor 4, a chain of mistakes and flawed design was about to unleash a disaster that would become one of the most infamous in modern history. At 1:23 a.m. on April 26, the reactor exploded. The blast tore the roof off the building, sending radioactive material into the sky. Fire lit the night, burning with an invisible poison. The explosion released more radiation than the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. In an instant, the world had changed. In Pripyat, just a few miles away, families slept peacefully. They had no idea that radiation was seeping silently into their homes, coating the playgrounds, the food, the very air they breathed. Children played outside the next morning as if nothing had happened. Some picked up graphite chunks from the reactor, not knowing they were holding lethal fragments. By the time evacuation was ordered 36 hours later, it was already too late for many. The immediate toll was horrific. Plant workers and firefighters who rushed to the scene suffered burns, vomiting, and fatal radiation sickness. They had fought the flames without protective gear, unaware of the danger. Many died within weeks, their bodies so contaminated that coffins had to be sealed in concrete. Imagine running toward a fire, believing you were saving a city, only to discover you had absorbed death itself. The long-term consequences were even worse. Vast regions of Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia were contaminated. Hundreds of thousands were forced to abandon their homes. Entire villages vanished, swallowed by weeds and silence. Thyroid cancer rates soared, birth defects increased, and survivors carried scars both visible and invisible. Chernobyl became not just a place, but a warning. Now ask yourself, what would you have done if you lived in Pripyat that morning? Would you have trusted the authorities who insisted all was safe? Would you have fled, leaving everything behind, or would you have stayed, watching the playgrounds fill with children while the Geiger counters screamed? There is grim irony in the cover-up that followed. Soviet officials tried to minimize the disaster, delaying international admission even as radiation drifted into Europe. In Sweden, alarms at a nuclear plant detected fallout, forcing the truth into the open. The world learned not from those responsible, but from distant scientists reading the poisoned air. And yet, in the midst of horror, there were acts of heroism. Workers volunteered for suicide missions, draining water beneath the reactor to prevent a second explosion, or digging tunnels to stabilize the core. Many knew they would not survive, but they went anyway. Their sacrifice prevented further catastrophe, perhaps saving millions of lives. Today, Chernobyl is both a ghost and a museum. Pripyat's Ferris wheel stands rusting, frozen on the eve of its first use. Schools remain abandoned, children's shoes scattered across floors. Nature has reclaimed the city. Wolves, deer, and birds roam freely where humans cannot. It is hauntingly beautiful, but also toxic, a reminder of what happens when technology and arrogance collide. The Chernobyl disaster is not just history, it is a lesson. It shows how secrecy, denial, and human error can magnify tragedy. It reminds us that progress without caution is peril. And it asks a chilling question: if it happened once, could it happen again? Picture America in the 1830s. The frontier is expanding, settlers pushing westward in search of land and opportunity. But for the Native American nations who had lived there for centuries, this expansion spelled catastrophe. Under pressure from white settlers and sanctioned by the government, the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole peoples faced forced removal from their ancestral lands. What followed is remembered as the Trail of Tears, a march of suffering that scarred the continent forever. In 1830, President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act, giving the federal government authority to negotiate relocation treaties. But in practice, it was not negotiation, it was coercion. Native nations were pressured, tricked, or forced into signing away their homelands. The Cherokee even won a Supreme Court case affirming their sovereignty, but Jackson ignored the ruling, reportedly saying, "Let them enforce it." The removals began. Families were rounded up, their homes burned, their farms seized. Soldiers drove them into makeshift camps, often with little food or shelter. From there, they were marched westward, sometimes 1,000 miles toward Indian Territory, present-day Oklahoma. The journeys took months, across rivers, mountains, and freezing plains. The suffering was immense. Disease spread through the camps. Measles, dysentery, and cholera claimed lives before the marches even began. On the road, exposure and starvation took even more. Estimates suggest that of the 16,000 Cherokee forced west, about 4,000 died. Other tribes suffered similar losses. Imagine walking barefoot through snow, carrying your child, watching elders collapse beside you, while soldiers pushed you forward at gunpoint. The tragedy was not just physical, it was cultural. Sacred lands were lost, burial grounds abandoned, communities torn apart. For nations that measured their identity in connection to the earth, being uprooted was a wound deeper than any famine. Languages, traditions, and ways of life were fractured, some lost forever. Now ask yourself, if you were there, a soldier knocking at your door, ordering you to leave your home within hours, what would you have taken? A family heirloom, a handful of cornmeal, or nothing at all, forced to walk into uncertainty with only grief as your companion? There is bitter irony in how settlers justified the removal. They spoke of progress, of civilization spreading west, even as they destroyed civilizations that had existed long before theirs. To the Cherokee, who had built schools, newspapers, and even a written constitution, being labeled uncivilized was a cruel hypocrisy. And yet, there were moments of resilience. On the marches, people sang songs to keep spirits alive. Elders told stories to children, so traditions would not vanish. Some communities rebuilt in the new territory, determined that survival itself would be resistance. But the loss was staggering, and the memory became an inherited scar passed down through generations. Today, the Trail of Tears is remembered through memorials, museums, and stories. But it is also remembered in the silence of Native families who still live with the echoes of displacement. The land we walk on carries memory. The rivers, the mountains, the forests, all once walked by those driven from their homes. The Trail of Tears is not just a story of Native American history. It is a story of America itself, of ambition and cruelty, but also of survival and resilience. It forces us to confront the cost of expansion, and to ask whether progress is worth the suffering it leaves behind. Picture Leningrad, today's street. Petersburg, in September 1941. The streets are alive with factories, music halls, and families strolling along the Neva River. But then, the German army encircles the city. Supply lines are cut, railways destroyed, and the ring tightens. What begins is not just a military campaign, but a siege that will last nearly 900 days, one of the longest and most brutal in history. The city was home to nearly 3 million people. Hitler's plan was not simply conquest, but starvation. Bombs and artillery rained down, but it was hunger that became the deadliest weapon. As winter came, rations shrank to almost nothing, 125 grams of bread per day, often mixed with sawdust to stretch supplies. People boiled wallpaper paste for starch, ate pets, and stripped bark from trees. Diaries tell of parents watching their children waste away, powerless to help. The cold was merciless. Temperatures plunged below -30 degrees C. With fuel gone, families burned furniture, books, even floorboards to keep warm. Entire apartment blocks froze. Corpses lay in stairwells, too many to bury. Snow covered the city, muffling cries of the starving. Yet life continued in strange, heroic ways. The Philharmonic Orchestra performed Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony, written during the siege itself. Musicians were so weak from hunger that some collapsed during rehearsal, but the performance was broadcast across the city, a defiant reminder that culture and spirit could survive even when bodies could not. Imagine sitting in that hall, ribs protruding from hunger, listening to music rise like a heartbeat against death. Now ask yourself, if you had lived there, would you have shared your last crust of bread with a neighbor? Would you have eaten wallpaper paste, or worse, to stay alive? What choices would hunger have forced upon you? Survival in Leningrad was not about bravery. It was about enduring a nightmare day after day. Cannibalism, though rare, did occur. Police recorded hundreds of cases, evidence of the desperation that consumed the city. It was a taboo no one wanted to speak of, but hunger drove people beyond limits. Even mentioning it today carries a shiver of what humans can become under siege. Relief came through the Road of Life, a frozen route across Lake Ladoga, used to bring supplies and evacuate civilians. Trucks drove over thin ice under constant enemy fire, many sinking into the black water below. For those who made it, the road meant survival. For many others, it was a grave. By the time the siege ended in January 1944, over 1 million civilians had died, more than in the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. Entire generations were scarred, survivors carrying trauma in silence for decades. Yet the city did not fall. Leningrad endured, and in endurance found a kind of victory. The Siege of Leningrad is remembered as both horror and heroism. It shows the cruelty of war, not just on soldiers, but on ordinary families trapped in its shadow. And it reminds us that human resilience, though extraordinary, often comes at unimaginable cost. Picture April 1912. The RMS Titanic, the largest and most luxurious ship of its time, set sail from Southampton bound for New York. It was hailed as unsinkable, a floating palace of marble staircases, chandeliers, and first-class cabins more lavish than hotels on land. On board were over 2,200 people, wealthy magnates, hopeful immigrants, families, and crew, all sharing a voyage that promised safety and glory. But in the freezing waters of the North Atlantic, that promise would shatter. On the night of April 14th, the Titanic struck an iceberg. At first, the impact felt like nothing more than a jolt, almost harmless. Passengers laughed, continued their card games, and sipped champagne. But beneath the surface, steel plates buckled, rivets popped, and water poured in. The ship's designers had said she could survive 4 flooded compartments. The iceberg had opened 5. Confusion turned to panic as the truth emerged. The Titanic was doomed. Lifeboats were lowered, but there were too few for all aboard. Women and children first, officers shouted, while families clung together, refusing to separate. Some lifeboats were launched half-empty, while hundreds remained trapped on the sinking decks. Imagine standing on that tilted deck, the ocean rising, knowing space was running out, not just on the ship but for life itself. The band played on, offering music to calm the chaos. Survivors later recalled the haunting strains of hymns drifting over the icy water. Below decks, crew members fought to keep the lights burning, sacrificing their lives to buy others a few more minutes. Heroism and cowardice mixed freely. Some men disguised themselves to board lifeboats, while others gave up their places willingly. As the ship broke apart, the cold claimed its victims. The water was near freezing. Within minutes of immersion, limbs stiffened, lungs filled with icy brine, and cries for help pierced the night. Survivors in lifeboats watched helplessly as hundreds slipped beneath the surface, their voices fading into silence. Only about 700 people survived. Over 1,500 perished. Now ask yourself, if you had been there, what would you have done? Would you have pushed for a seat on a lifeboat, even if it meant taking someone else's chance? Would you have stayed with family, even if it meant certain death? Or would you have stood on deck like some did, calmly smoking a cigarette as the sea swallowed the ship? There is grim irony in the Titanic's fate. It was built as a triumph of modern engineering, celebrated as indestructible. Yet it took just one iceberg, one April night, to prove otherwise. The disaster became a symbol of human arrogance, of the dangers of believing technology can conquer nature. And yet, the Titanic is not remembered only for death, but for stories of courage. A third-class Irish mother who bundled her children into a lifeboat before stepping back onto the ship. Musicians who played until the end. Officers who stayed at their posts, guiding passengers though they knew they would drown. Today, the Titanic rests on the ocean floor, broken but still majestic. Rust-eaten railings, silent dining rooms, and empty cabins echo with memory. Tourists and explorers gaze at her through submersibles, struck by both her grandeur and her graveyard silence. She remains a time capsule of a night when wealth, class, and power meant nothing against the sea. The Titanic disaster endures not because it was unique, but because it tells us something eternal. That even the greatest human achievements can crumble in an instant. It is a story of pride, tragedy, and the fragile line between life and death on the open water. Picture Rwanda in April 1994. The hills are green, the air filled with the sound of birds, and villages bustle with life. But beneath that beauty, tension simmers. Decades of ethnic division between Hutu and Tutsi, inflamed by colonial policies and political manipulation, had turned neighbors into enemies. When the plane carrying President Juvenal Habyarimana was shot down on April 6, the fragile peace shattered. What followed was one of the fastest and most brutal genocides in human history. Within hours, militias and mobs began attacking. Roadblocks sprang up across the country. Armed with machetes, clubs, and guns, Hutu extremists hunted Tutsis and moderate Hutus alike. Entire families were slaughtered in their homes, churches, and schools. The violence spread with horrifying speed. In just 100 days, nearly 800,000 people were killed, men, women, and children, often by their own neighbors. Imagine the terror of hearing footsteps outside your house, knowing the knock on the door could be your last. Imagine running through fields, chased not by strangers but by people you once shared meals with. Imagine hiding in a church, believing you had found sanctuary, only to have the doors broken down and death follow you inside. The cruelty was staggering. Victims were tortured, humiliated, and killed with shocking brutality. Bodies filled rivers, roads, and ditches. Radio stations broadcast hate, urging people to cut down the tall trees, a coded call to kill Tutsis. It was propaganda turned into murder, words transformed into weapons sharper than steel. Now ask yourself, if you were in Rwanda then, what would you have done? Would you have hidden your neighbors at risk of your own life? Would you have joined the killers to save your family from suspicion? Or would you have fled, knowing there was no safe place to run? Survival became a moral labyrinth with no clear answers. There were moments of humanity amid the horror. Some Hutu risked everything to shelter Tutsi families, building false walls in their homes or leading them through forests at night. Others shared the last of their food with the hunted, even when they had little themselves. These acts of courage shine like faint lights in an overwhelming darkness. The world watched, but too slowly. International peacekeepers were limited, and global powers hesitated. The United Nations failed to act decisively, and foreign governments debated while people died by the thousands. For survivors, the silence of the world is a wound as deep as the violence itself. When the killing finally ended, Rwanda was in ruins. Families were erased, villages destroyed, and trust shattered. Yet from the ashes, the country began to rebuild. Trials were held, both in international courts and in community Gakaka gatherings, where perpetrators confessed and sought forgiveness. It was imperfect, painful, but a step toward healing. Today, Rwanda is known for resilience and renewal. The hills are still green, the markets busy again, but the memory of 1994 lingers in every family. Memorials stand across the country, with skulls, clothes, and photographs of victims reminding visitors that the genocide was not a distant story, it was lived by real people. The Rwandan Genocide is one of history's most disturbing true stories, not only for its scale, but because it showed how ordinary people, under the pressure of hate and fear, could commit extraordinary cruelty. And it reminds us of something vital, that vigilance, compassion, and courage are the only defenses against hatred when it begins to whisper again. And now, as our journey through these disturbing true stories from history comes to an end, take a deep breath. You have traveled across centuries, from medieval plagues to modern disasters, from cities in flames to families caught in wars, from whispers of witchcraft to the silence of genocide. Each story was heavy, chilling, sometimes even unbearable. Yet you stayed. You listened. And in doing so, you carried the memory of those who came before us. History is not just dates and names, it is lives. Lives of ordinary people who laughed, feared, loved, and suffered, just like us. Their stories remind us how fragile life can be, how powerful fear is, and how resilience shines even in darkness. Perhaps tonight, as you close your eyes, you will not only think of horror, but also of survival, courage, and the lessons left behind. Before you drift into sleep, I want to thank you. Thank you for spending your time with me, for opening your heart to stories that are not easy to hear. Your presence here keeps history alive. And if you found value in this journey, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who might also find meaning in these tales. But most importantly, I want to hear from you. Which story struck you the hardest? Was it the silent hunger of Leningrad, the frozen fate of the Titanic, the madness of Salem, Oregon, the shadow of Chernobyl? Or perhaps another story spoke to you in ways words cannot explain? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one, and your thoughts shape the journeys we take together in the future. And if there is a story from history, a mystery, or even a legend you would like me to tell next time, let me know. This channel is not just mine, it is ours. A place where we keep the voices of the past alive, so that their lessons, however dark, are never forgotten. Now rest easy. Let the past fade into dreams. Tomorrow is another day, and though history is full of shadows, it also teaches us to cherish the light. Good night, my friend. Until next time.